Well, the world of work certainly has seen some unique changes in the last few years. Remote work obviously being one of the bigger ones, but you also have technology like AI becoming a more important component in our jobs as well. So where do we stand right now as we're coming towards the end of 2024, and what would we consider as we head into 2025? Pleasure to be joined here in studio by Peter Cappelli, management professor here at the Wharton School and also director of the Center for Human Resources. Great to see you again. How are you?
Thank you. I'm hanging in there.
How are you viewing then work and the workplace right now?
I I don't know who first said this, so let's just, if we can't think of it, I'll just credit it to me, that the future looks like the past, only more so. And what that means is don't expect, enormous changes overnight in anything. And that if you want to bet where things are going to be in a few years, you look at the trends which are already underway, and they're likely to continue. So if you go out a few years, it could look like a big change. If you're in the middle of it, it doesn't feel like quite so much, I think, the biggest change for people has actually been the tight job market. So post-pandemic, and more than technology, or maybe remote work is up there, but, having gone through generations from 1973 through to 2017, the unemployment rate in the U.S. fell below 4% only once in more than 40 years. And so we grew up in that period. It was a lousy job market for 40 years. And since 2018, it's been 4%, below 4% effectively every year.
Yeah.
And that is a real sea change, right? That you have more choices, people can quit and go someplace else. And that has, sort of shaken up a lot of things. So I'd say that on the ground for people has been the biggest change. Remote work, if you've got it, is an enormous change, but it's always stunning to tell people that only 26% of U.S. employers have any kind of remote or hybrid work.
Yeah, because it feels like it's a lot more.
It feels like it's a lot, and the reason it does is because that's what the press talks about.
Right.
And something we discovered, one of my former students and I, Shoshana Schwartz, we just totaled up the size of the industry that supports human resources now in the U.S.
Right.
And that industry is $1.9 trillion. So it's the same size as the official GNP of Italy. So it's enormous, and they spend 10% of their budget on marketing. And what they're telling you is almost never, don't worry about it, nothing to see here, right?
Right.
They're constantly telling you things are wrong and different and everything is going to change, et cetera. And the reality is probably not nearly so much.
But it even feels like remote work is even changing to a degree.
It is.
As we're seeing incrementally companies calling back workers into the office, whether that be 5 days a week, 3-4 days a week, whatever that combination is. And it always felt to me, even as we went through the pandemic, and this is just my experience, is it just feels like we were going to get to a higher level of back in office at some point. It was just when, companies were going to make that move.
Yeah, it's a great point because it also explains the problem that companies had. I think it worked way better than anybody expected, but that did not mean it was great. Right. And a lot of the problems are ones that accumulate over time. The most obvious of those is once you start hiring new people in, they don't know in a remote organization what the place is like. They don't know what's going on. They don't know the culture. You do that for a year. It's not such a big deal. You do it for 4 years of people, which is what we've done now. 4 years of new hires who never knew the old organization, the office, and the culture of the place. You get a different kind of organization after a few years. So the problem and the problems associated with remote work accumulated and started to get worse. And now you are seeing companies also start thinking, it did work better than we thought, but it's not perfect. And let's see whether we can start getting people back. The downside is exactly what you pointed out, is they said nothing for 4 years, or the last 3. And so people understandably thought, okay, this is the way it's going to be.
Right.
And now they're really angry if you bring them back.
Well, and I was going to say, the expectation now, it feels like by younger generations, is that there is a component of remote work that they should expect as part of their job moving forward.
Yeah, and some of that came out of their experience in school, high school, and that's actually a problem that we have seen here with students, and my colleagues elsewhere see the same thing. And with the experience in high school was not just teaching remote, so you didn't have to come to class for anything, but also a sense that, frankly, we lowered the standards, right? Because we didn't want to fail anybody in that time of crisis for the country. And so their perceptions of what is required, just got awfully sloppy.
Right.
And so that's something we're dealing with now, and it's not always fun.
How do you think companies have adapted to that dynamic of the workforce and having so many people available and the ability for somebody to just pick up and leave, which really wasn't the case if you go back, 30, 40 years? It's a dynamic that obviously, or I should say it's an adjustment that companies really have to make.
Yeah, it is a great point. And I think the problem is they have not adapted to it. They've just been bearing the costs and not paying much attention to it. And the reason for that is something we've talked about with you before, and this is this strange issue of accounting, financial accounting. So there's no ability, if you're an investor, say, to look at a company and see, is turnover costing them money or not? Because there's no evidence on it. Companies won't tell you their turnover numbers. And if you're a CEO of a company, you're not managing to your turnover numbers because nobody sees them. But you are managing to your compensation numbers. So if you're underpaying people for a while and it's causing you to lose people, you're not doing as much about it as you should if you were trying to worry about the overall effectiveness of the company. If you're just playing to the numbers, you're willing to tolerate higher levels of turnover that don't make business sense, but they might make accounting sense, right? So I'd say, unfortunately, they're not doing as much about that as they should. We're seeing, for example, employee life-related issues, health issues, perceived well-being, all that stuff, mental health problems really getting worse and worse and worse. I confess I'm not sure exactly why, but the numbers are going up over time, so it's not just, some weird one-shot thing. And, companies aren't doing much of anything about it. They're giving you more chair yoga programs, but they're not dealing with the things that are causing the stress in the first place, like constant restructuring and downsizing.
So is the focus on culture in the office, having that kind of framework, is it a little bit overrated then in terms of what is going on and how it's going on?
I think the story on almost everything these days is, what do people at the very top of the company think? Because it's so top down, the need for everybody underneath to make sure that the very top folks are on board with everything you're doing,
right.
And I think they all believe and understand that culture kind of matters. They don't have much of an idea of what their culture actually is. And it's often not nearly as great as they think it is. And I think they are aware that remote work in particular is just eroding your culture. People don't see each other. You learn culture by observation, by seeing what's rewarded and particularly what's punished. You don't even have gossip anymore to figure out, who got fired for what. Company doesn't want to talk about it, but everybody knows, right? You learn that stuff. That's all gone. I think they understand this at a kind of gut level. They also don't think they have to do much about it, unfortunately, to make it better. And they're really, really reluctant to spend money on anything. So if you could suggest that there are things you could do that don't cost anything, they're probably inclined to do that.
Yeah.
But a lot of these innovations, like let's take our culture more seriously, would also require their time.
Right.
We need our managers to be seen, to be visible. They need to see you walking around. Well, that means I got to take time away from deal making and, conversations with investors. Do I want to do that? No.
I saw you talk earlier this year about the component of entry-level jobs and the fact that there are instances where even the entry-level job requires a couple of years of experience. Why has that happened, and what kind of an impact is it having?
Yeah, well, that particularly after the Great Recession, we started to see employers just ramp up the requirements, and the reason was they could. They had lots of people just saying, how high would you like me to jump? So they just started adding requirements and adding requirements. And, on our campuses, you discovered that students couldn't get internships unless they had already had an internship, because nobody wanted to be the first person to give them break them in as to what it means to actually show up on time and that stuff, right? So I think, we still have a problem on the hiring side in that employers are unrealistic about what they're looking for given what they're willing to pay. And some of that is just sloppiness. We hire by committee. Just tell me, what would you like to see in this job? And then what would you like to see? And we just add them up and you end up with this Christmas tree that nobody is qualified for, right? So that still goes on. I think what's different now is they pay a price for it. So time to fill positions is going up and companies just leave positions vacant, and CFOs often think that saves money. It hurts performance, it hurts economic costs, but finance, again, in terms of accounting, it might look like you're saving money. So, it's this dilemma between, are you trying to run an effective organization, or are you trying to run one that looks good on paper?
How do you view the use of AI in the workplace, how it will be used and relied upon? And also, there was the narrative for a while about AI replacing jobs, but it feels like it's now more of AI is going to be a complement to human jobs.
Yeah, it's again this story about vendors. If you ask the people who are creating something what it can do, you get this incredible story. And it might be true that it literally could do those things, but it turns out that not everybody wants them. And to do them sometimes costs an unbelievable amount of money, right? So, for example, generative AI could write all your form letters for you now. Yeah, it could do that, but nobody writes those now. They're all form letters. They've gone through legal. No manager sitting down and handwriting notes to customers, right? So a lot of stuff they could do doesn't need to be done. I think when we're looking at actually trying to automate work, as they say, which means take over these tasks from workers, it's really hard to make that go. It takes a ton of IT time and money, and generative AI, which can do great things, is no longer cheap. It's quite expensive to get the most, the fanciest stuff. Right. And the problem is the things they're trying to automate are low value. And we think, okay, we'll do those first because they're low value. But the problem is if you need expensive AI to automate something that's cheap, there's no way it's going to pay off, right? It's one thing to get fancy generative AI to do gene sequencing for you, something of real value.
Yeah.
It's another to get really expensive AI to read forms, know? And so I think we discovered the same thing we discovered a while ago with robotics, and that is it's not taking over anybody's jobs, really. It might take over a task or two from people,
right.
Not the whole job. That's a good thing. I mean, none of this is bad. It's just that the hype was so out of proportion to the reality. And the reason is the hype comes from the people who are building the tools, not the people who are trying to use them. And what I'm discovering is, you look at these surveys of people who say they're using these tools, and you get these really high numbers. The reason is they're often under pressure to use them. So I've heard from some HR people who say their CEO has given them mandates to say, got to automate 30% of this. So what do? They claim that anything they're using is AI. So applicant tracking software, which is simply word recognition stuff, been around for 25 years or so, we're using AI, right? And if you go to your computer and you ask ChatGPT to look up something we're using AI, right? But are you actually replacing people with it? The evidence on that is it's really, really rare, right? So I don't think it's going to change very much. To automate a particular job takes a ton of work. Somebody's got to be willing to front all that money, and you're in competition with all these other investment deals for it. So I think the problem here is, again, expectations. We believed that this stuff is free. ChatGPT is free, so just use that. But that won't help you automate these tasks. And the cost of this, company's been giving away this software. They're not in business to give this stuff away.
Right, exactly.
And it's getting more and more expensive as more people use it, right?
Is there something then you are watchful for as we flip the calendar to 2025 in and around work, workplace, workforce?
Well, I think there are political issues. It's now a full employment project to try to understand why President Trump won. And it all centers around working class people and complaints about not getting what they felt they should get from the workplace and from jobs and things. And but we are installing in Washington a pretty employer-friendly workplace, which is clawing back, pretty clearly going to claw back the Biden administration's efforts to help unions, and some of those on things like mandatory overtime to make it more applicable more broadly to more jobs and all those kinds of things. So I think the interesting political situation is going to be to see, was the original story right, that working class people switched allegiance because they didn't think the Democrats were delivering for them, but then we're moving toward a model which, at least traditionally, was going to be worse for them. And what's the response to that going to be? Or does it turn out that that's actually not why they voted the way they did, right? So I think that's the big question, at least in the pundit class we're working for. Yeah. I think on the ground, I think we're hearing an awful lot of talk about remote work among managers now because they are rethinking this. Part of it recently because Amazon quite publicly called everybody back in the office, and not just called them back, but is making them come back, which is a different thing than just saying you got to come back. Yeah. And they told them, they're going to start firing people, really, if you don't come back. So that has suddenly got the attention of lots of other companies that were feeling like they should do it. Is the time right? Is the labor market soft enough? We're not worried about what the HR people told us that everybody's going to quit. Right. So I'd say in practice on the ground, that's the big issue.
Peter, great to see you again. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Peter Cappelli, management professor here at the Wharton School.